I was given 12 days to rebuild the core of a production Flutter application. The codebase had accumulated years of complexity. It was difficult to change safely, the application had serious stability problems, and Bluetooth communication with physical hardware depended on an abstraction that no longer gave us enough control. I finished the rewrite in 10 days, but the hardest part wasn't writing the code. It was deciding what to preserve, what to replace, and which best practices were actually creating more complexity. This is how I took ownership of an application and rebuilt its mobile foundation. The application is a companion app for a physical device. User can pair the device, control programs, update its firmware, and keep the application synchronized with what is happening on the hardware. That synchronization was especially important because the mobile application didn't own all of the state. A session could begin from the phone, it could also begin directly from the physical device, helmet. So the application had to coordinate real hardware, an existing backend, a local data, and unreliable connectivity while presenting one consistent state to the user. Problem wasn't one bad class or one outdated dependency. The application had reached a point where making change safely was extremely difficult. Responsibilities were mixed together, the state changed unpredictable, and a small update could cause regressions somewhere completely different. There were also not enough tests protecting the most important workflows. As a result, every change required more time, caution, while new fixes continued to increase the existing complexity. Eventually, these engineering problems began reaching users through crashes and performance issues, Bluetooth problems and inconsistent behaviors, and so on. So the structure of the application was no longer only slowing down development, it was limiting the product. A rewrite should never be the default response to a difficult code base. Starting over can introduce new bugs, remove years of accumulated behavior, and waste most rebuilding things user already depend on. So the question wasn't whether I could write a cleaner application. The real question was whether we could continue improving the product safely inside the existing structure. So, could we isolate the critical workflows? Could we change the state management without unpredictable regressions? Could we properly test the existing behavior? Could we gain enough control over Bluetooth? And would another patch reduce the complexity or simply add another layer? In this case, continuing to patch the application had become more risky than replacing its mobile foundation. So I took the initiative and proposed a controlled rewrite. I was given 2 weeks to complete the rewrite. I finished the implementation in 10 days. I worked extremely long hours during that period, but the deadline was only possible because of the prioritization. I couldn't redesign every business rule or replace every external system, and I had to identify which parts were actively preventing us from moving forward and rebuild those first. At the same time, I preserved the existing behavior that we couldn't afford rediscover during a 10-day implementation. The goal wasn't build a perfect system. The goal was to create a stable, understandable foundation that we could continue developing safely. This wasn't a purity driven rewrite. The product already had years of behavior, and replacing everything at once would have introduced a completely different set of risks. So I preserved the necessary product logic and expectations of the existing backend. The application also had to remain the same product in the stores, so existing users would receive it as a normal update. Around that behavior, I rebuilt the application structure. The user interface and state management were rewritten. Network communication, local data application workflows, and the hardware communication were separated more clearly. The specific libraries are not important. The important change was the exact measure responsibility now had a clear boundary. A UI change shouldn't require understanding the Bluetooth implementation, and the hardware communication shouldn't be mixed into the presentation logic. One of the most important decisions was replacing the existing Flutter Bluetooth abstraction with native implementations. This doesn't mean Flutter Bluetooth packages are bad. They are often the right choice for common use cases and allow teams to move quickly, But the Bluetooth was not a secondary feature in this product. It was part of the core experience, and we needed to more control over connection behavior, device events, firmware differences, error handling, and the communication lifecycle. The existing abstraction was hiding the exact part of the system we most needed to control. So I created one stable contract on the Flutter side and implemented it separately on Android and iOS using their native Bluetooth APIs. So the platform implementations were different, but the behavior exposed to Flutter remained consistent. Flutter continued to own the shared product experience. Native code gave us control over the part that could no longer be generic. Rewriting the mobile application didn't mean I could redesign every around it. The application still had to support an existing backend and years of existing product behavior. Replacing those systems was outside the scope of the rewrite. So instead of allowing their limitations to spread through the new application, I placed clear boundaries around them. The backend could continue providing the format it already supported, while the mobile application translated into the models and the state that made sense internally. The rewrite didn't remove the external constraint, it contained them. Not every decision I made was correct. My biggest architecture mistake was initially trying to make almost everything offline first. I sounded reasonable because this was hardware replication and network connectivity could disappear. I began building the general queue that could store actions locally to synchronize them later, but not every operation had a meaningful offline behavior. For example, updating the username, right? Some actions require a live connection. Some data could safely be local. Other needed a hybrid approach. Trying to force everything into one offline first system created unnecessary queues, retries, conflicts, and failure states. So I replaced the universal solution with an explicit decision for each workflow. An operation could be online only, local available, or hybrid. The lesson was simple. Offline first is not something you apply to entire application by default. It's a product decision that should be made per workflow. Rewrite was not the end of the work. Over the following months, and continue stabilizing the application and solving the edge cases that only appear when the real user interact with real hardware. Eventually, I became the primary engineer responsible for the mobile application and its technical direction. The application still isn't perfect. Production software never is, but it is now a system we can understand, maintain, and improve with confidence. I took three main lessons from this experience. First, a rewrite is not automatically reckless. Starting over is risky, but continuously patching a system that can no longer change safely is also risky. Second, the abstractions are only useful while they preserve the control your product needs. Removing an abstraction is sometimes the only way to regain that control. And third, architecture decisions should follow real product behavior, not ideology. Offline first, reusable abstractions and clean architecture can be all useful, but when a pattern creates more complexity than the product requires, it is no longer simplifying the system, it is becoming the system. This was one of the most intense projects I worked on, but also one of the most rewarding. Taking an application that had been difficult to maintain for years and turning it into something I could genuinely understand, own, and continue improving changed the way I think about engineering responsibility. There are still many things I want to improve, and there are a lot more stories I can share from the hardware side of this project, but for now, I hope this gave you a honest look at what rebuilding a real production Flutter application actually involves. I'm Alper, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.